You may start.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the South African Renewable Energy Policy Roundtable discussion, focusing on utility scale and self-generation opportunities. Before we start our roundtable discussion, we have an address from the Deputy Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Dr. Nabushle Pamela Nkabane. She was born in the village of Mfwendi, situated in Umzinkulu, Harry Gwala district in KwaZulu-Natal. She became a Member of Parliament of South Africa in the 6th administration, 2019, under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa, where she was deployed as the Whip of Employment and Labour Portfolio Committee of Parliament, until recently assigned by the President of the Republic of South Africa as Deputy Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, effectively sworn in on the 6th of August, 2021. In her new responsibility as the Deputy Minister for the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, she is determined to champion together with the dedicated staff the issue of getting more women, youth, and people living with disabilities participating in the mainstream economy and operating activities, a sector that has for many years been dominated by men and the minority. Without further ado, over to you, Deputy Minister.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sasha Singh, Annelies van der Merwe, DMRE and DTI team, Mr. Nhlanhla Gwede from NERSA, Mr. Bernard Magoro from IPPO, distinguished guests and participants, good morning. It is with a profound sense of gratitude that we have been afforded this opportunity to participate in this auspicious Dubai Expo series of events with a view to showcase what South Africa has to offer as investment opportunities in various economic fields of our country. Today, we are here to showcase renewable energy opportunities. This comes at a time as the global community has gathered in Glasgow to deliberate under the ambit of the country's party to the Paris Agreement of COP26. As South Africa, we recognize that global warming is a real threat to humanity, hence our extensive commitment to the Renewable program. We established in South Africa the Independent Power Producer Office, which is responsible for the public procurement of renewable energy. At some other sessions here in these pavilions, we'll speak more on storage technology issues and challenges as basis to enhance the viability of renewable energy, where in particular wind and solar PV is concerned. We recognize the very importance of policy certainty as precondition for foreign direct investment. Hence, we have the Integrated Resource Plan 2019 as our blueprint on energy bills until at least 2030. In this policy, IRP 2019 policy posture, has our target 17,800 megawatts as part of the energy sources to be procured in South Africa. To date, over 93 independent power producer projects totaling to 7,308 megawatts have been procured, and 89 of these projects up to Win 4 of the Procurement program have been connected to the grid, offering 6,855 megawatts. Of these, 86 are renewable energy projects, 2 diesel plants, and 5 small power plants. As part of ensuring broad-based affordable entry into the energy space, we've also have the small projects renewable energy program for those entities that can produce between 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts. These are small projects that operate in the space of onshore wind, solar PV, biomass, biogas, and landfill gas. We believe all these are part of what must contribute to combating climate change and renewable energy sources. As part of mitigating against the disequilibrium in the energy supply and demand market, we have passed as law the provision for small-scale embedded generation must increase from a mere megawatt to 100 megawatt without the need for a license from NERSA. Up to date, there had been 438 entities registered by the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, with a total of 206 megawatt for own use purpose only. We are as yet to register more generation following the increase of the threshold to 100 megawatt for own use without a requirement for a license. This is part of the policy initiatives to boost investor confidence by enabling private corporate entities and other utilities to generate own electricity in an affordable and sustainable way. Much of such generation will come from renewable energy, such as PV and wind. The Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Honorable Gwede Mantashe, is also empowered to make ministerial risk mitigation independent power producer procurement program, and recently this has totaled to 1,995 megawatts with 11 preferred bidder projects appointed. These are expected to be connecting to the grid in about 18 months from the date of the sign-off on the 28th October of 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, the renewable energy space is vibrant in South Africa, hence countries such as Britain, Germany, France, and the US have committed themselves recently to pilot renewable energy investment with an initial $8.5 billion up to an award to its pioneering work on renewable energy procurement, which is done independent. I'm sorry, my network is unstable, which is done independent of the executive authority to ensure fairness. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa highly endowed with the platinum group metals, which is about 75% of world supply and is vital for fuel cell and hydrogen production. These minerals include vanadium used in batteries and platinum in fuel cells. The rapid developing global green hydrogen market is a significant opportunity for South Africa to position itself as a global competitor in future green energy markets. South Africa has therefore invested tremendously on hydrogen research to the Hydrogen South Africa program of HySA to take advantage of the hydrogen economy as the future of global clean energy. We have today here NERSA and the REIPPP office executives, our support staff, which is Mr. Gwede and Mr. Bernard Mahoro, respectively, who will expand on any information you might need with regards to both regulatory and program offerings from our renewable energy programs. I thank you so much, program facilitator.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. I think we can then proceed to start with the roundtable discussion. The Deputy Minister gave a very good introduction, so I'm not going to repeat any of what she has said. Safe to say that the reforms and developments which she's mentioned are expected to unlock significant investment in new generation capacity in the short and medium term. And that's what the focus of this discussion is going to be. Joining us on the panel today, we have Mr. Bernard Magoro, who's the head of the REIPPP office. We have Ms. Lucy Chege, who's the head of Energy, Environment, and Information Communications and Technologies at the Development Bank of South Africa. We have Mr. Mhlana Gumede, who's the regulator member at NERSA. We have Mr. Brian Damas, who's the CEO of African Rainbow Energy and Power. And we have Mr. Dani Mouton, who's the acting head of Distributed Generation Energy at Exxaro Resources. So once again, thank you very much to the Deputy Minister for that address, as well as to our panelists for joining us today. I think to start off the discussion, Mr. Makgoro, maybe perhaps I can ask you just to give us a brief overview of the renewable energy rollout going forward, particularly focusing on round 6 and beyond. And I think what would be of particular interest is, in the short term, are we still on track for bid window 6 at the end of January? And what lessons have we learned from the various rounds and efficiencies that can be used in round 6? Thanks, Mr. Makgoro.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Good morning, Honorable Deputy Minister, other panel members, and the investors and the audience that have joined us this morning. I'm glad to be here. As Sasha mentioned, I am the head of the REIPPP office. The REIPPP office has been in operation for the last 10 years. We have been procuring energy on behalf of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, particularly from IPPs. To this end, as the Deputy Minister has mentioned, we have procured quite a number of IPP programs, and we have at least 90 IPPs that have signed the PPAs. Over 86 of those are already generating power through an ESCOM grid, and the rest are scheduled to come online within the next year or so. And as the Deputy Minister mentioned, in the last year, in the last 12 months, we have procured another 2,000 megawatts thereabout of what we call the risk mitigation IPP program. In that, it also included quite a number of innovative ideas because we wanted a dispatchable capacity. So we also have combinations of gas and renewables and storage. So it was quite an interesting program, and we look forward to signing that program at the end of January. And recently we have announced 25 preferred bidders for bid window 5. They are now busy finalizing the agreements, and we're hoping to sign that program by the end of April. So that's where we are. So a lot of achievements have been made, and there's quite a lot of activities on the ground in South Africa around renewable energy. And we have actually proven that South Africa, is a safe destination for renewable energy through this program. But beyond bid window 5, just back to Sasha's question, bid window 6 is on track. We made a commitment to the minister that we will release the RFP not later than end of January 2022. What we are busy with now is the drafting, and obviously the key issue is around the grid. So after bid window 5, we had to make sure that ESCOM gets some time to look at the grid and give the market an indication where the opportunities are for future investments in the transmission grid specifically. So that's where we are on bid window 6. Bid window 6 will be released early next year, and with bid window 6, we're also planning to release the storage as well. This is part of what we call the second determination that the minister announced in September 2019, which included 6,800 megawatts of renewables, PV and wind, and also 3,000 megawatts of gas, and another 1,500 megawatts of coal, and lastly, the 513 megawatts of battery storage. So bid window 6 will add another 2,600 megawatts to the bid window 5, 2,600 megawatts. And thereafter, we'll be left with another 1,600 megawatts of wind, which we're planning to release as bid window 7, also scheduled for sometime in 2022. Gas and coal will also be released in the first quarter of 2022. But I believe even beyond the second determination, there is a need for more determinations to be released. But that is obviously subject to the minister's decision, and largely because of the two reasons. One, we have recently seen that ESCOM is battling to meet the demand due to poor performance on the coal fleet. So I believe that there is a need to accelerate the procurement of more capacity, particularly renewable energy capacity. And the second reason is that if you go back to 2019 IRP, we have allocated over 20 gigawatts of renewables, PV and wind, to be procured in the next 10 years. So it's going to be a very busy year, sort of busy 10 years in South Africa with procurement, and we expect more activities and more investors to come on board as well and join us in this journey. So I think it's also important to also mention that there is a reform happening in the industry, and perhaps Mr. Gwede will talk more about this, but these are also important developments that the investors have to keep in mind, starting with the announcement by the president of the lifting of the embedded generation to 100 megawatts. That obviously means that there will be a lot of activities in the private sector space as well, private PPA space. And secondly, the municipalities and ESCOM are also going to get their chance as well to procure directly from IPPs, especially in the renewable space. So I believe that it's going to be very exciting. And as the IPP office, we are geared to support the department in this procurement round. And we invite all investors, based on our track record, to come and share this space with us, and so that we can grow our economy as South Africa. Maybe the last important aspect to mention as well, with us over the years, it's always been not just about procuring megawatts, it's also about economic transformation, job creation, industrialization of the country. So future procurement programs are also geared in that direction as well. And that to us means opportunities for investors, opportunities across the whole value chain of the renewable energy space, from manufacturing to EPC to O&M. So we're hoping that with this 20 gigawatts that we're planning to procure of renewables in the next 10 years, South Africa will be able to maximize opportunities across the whole value chain. Sasha, I think I will stop here for now, and then we can address all the other market changes that we foresee going forward, perhaps after I've given the other panel members to give their introduction remarks. Thank you, Sasha. Over to you.
Thanks very much for that, Bernard. I think it's a very exciting time coming ahead. It's going to be a very busy 2021 and 10 years for the IPP office. I think we covered quite a bit on the procurement programs that are going to be released, and you did touch on the embedded generation sector. So maybe that is a good opportunity to ask Mr. Gwede just for an update on embedded generation regulatory, what changes are being made. The Deputy Minister did mention that the 100 megawatt threshold, the rules and the regulations relating to that are still in process. So Mr. Gwede, perhaps we could get an update on that from you.
Thank you, Sasha. Good morning, Deputy Minister. Good morning to other panel members. I think firstly, just to indicate that NESA has got the easiest of jobs, that is in respect of the 100 megawatts threshold, because unlike the license, the need for licensing, registration is a whole lot easier. We've had a few years now of practice with it, and clearly the idea was not necessarily to make the process a whole lot more difficult, and therefore the registration process is largely going to be kept the same. We are, however, of course, in terms of the registration fee, something that the energy regulator will still be deliberating on, because at the moment it's a meager 200 rands. And the question is, if you are registering a 100 megawatts, are you increasing perhaps the amount of work that the regulator has to do, and therefore would you actually need to actually adjust that But that is at this stage, it's something that is just in the corridors. It's not been discussed fully within the regulator. However, the actual registration procedures themselves were approved by the energy regulator last week, and because that's a delegated function to the subcommittee of the board, and that was discussed and approved, and that should be published on the NESA website as early as, I'm really hoping, and as early as the next 2 weeks. However, as indicated, there are no major changes to it, and only just to recognize that we've now moved from registering 1 megawatt to registering 100 megawatts, but the procedures there too actually haven't changed that much. Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks very much, Mr. Gwede. And just one more point that is just of particular interest. Previously, there was speak about regulation being made relating to grid connection. Is there any update on that, or how will grid connection work for embedded generation projects? Will it carry on as it is, or will there be particular permits, etc., that is required?
Clearly, everybody that generates power and is connected to the grid has to comply with the grid code. So the question is whether do you need to strengthen the grid code or not? So these issues are actually being dealt with by the committee that is which is delegated by NESA to look at the grid code, the compliance thereto. A committee that is comprising of all industry players, but they would then advise if there's a need for a change in terms of the grid code. But from where we're sitting at the moment, there is not a need for a change in the grid code. Of course, because the connections are not just going to be connected, the connections are not just on the ESCOM grid, transmission and distribution, but to municipality grid. Clearly, the extent, or rather the ability of each of the municipalities each municipality needs to assess its own needs, and then will be able to then indicate its ability to actually allow for grid connection. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Gwede. I think we've got a few more questions, but we'll come back to you. Let's hear from the private sector on the embedded generation opportunity, and perhaps I can turn to Mr. Brian Damas. Just to give us some of his views on the opportunity that's been made available by the 100 megawatts lifting the threshold.
Morning, Sasha, and morning, colleagues on the panel. Let me just reflect a little bit about more than just the 100 megawatts and make a few points. Firstly, South Africa is a very exciting place to be. It's got a growing energy market, and one of the largest growing energy markets in the world. Secondly, we have a world-class renewable procurement program run by the REIPPP office. It's been proven over years, and it's within a regulatory framework that provides investors confidence and has really achieved significant investment in the country. The third point is we as a South African company has got a very simple objective, and that is to make sure we use modern technology in order to bring affordable electricity to people, and renewables allow us to do that. And this is about power for people that don't have access, make sure it's affordable for the poor, and that this specific technologies also allow us to transition skills, transition jobs, transition our own manufacturing economy in the country. And that's quite an important point. And all of this, fourthly, happens in a context of a government that has got a very clear policy framework around its climate change commitments towards 2050, its energy policy towards 2030, and further reforms that deals with the private sector participation, including, as you've indicated, the private sector power. We as African Rainbow Energy and Power are invested already and will continue to invest both in the utility program as well as the private sector program. And for us, the 100 megawatt program has already seen over the last few weeks projects that we have on the book of over 400 megawatts that has been awarded by mining companies, by industry, that we're busy developing, closing, and rolling out. And this is quite exciting, not only for us as a company, but for the whole sector. And as I've indicated, one of the key issues that we have to deal with as a country are the issues, as Bernard indicated, around the grid. Those investments has to be made. But this is certainly, from our perspective as a company, a place that we will continue to invest, continue to grow that investment and participation in this market. And not only here, but also gives an opportunity and a platform to take that investment into the rest of Africa. And so an exciting place to be, a well-run program within a legal and regulatory construct that is sound and is absolutely world-class. Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you, Brian. While we're still on the topic of private sector participation in the embedded generation as well as utility scale projects, perhaps I can ask Dani for his views, particularly from a large industrialist company point of view.
Thank you, Sasha, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, Deputy Minister and panelists. Yes, for Exxaro, this is similar to what Brian was saying. It's truly an exciting phase in our company and in the country's growth in the renewable energy industry. I wouldn't comment on the programs. We participated in between the two, but not in the recent windows. So we have been in the industry for quite some time. We have 2 wind generation facilities, but we've also, as a private player, started about 3 years ago with investment in smaller scale private generation facilities to get familiar with the system, to provide power to communities, but more importantly, to prepare ourselves for when regulation reform is coming. And we're so excited about what Schedule 2 and the 100 megawatt announcement has brought, and the pipeline that is available to the country. Now, for a customer side on this, of course, this is exciting because of electricity prices in the past and in the recent past rising quite rapidly beyond inflation for whatever reasons. The companies have been looking at trying to get their production costs down, maybe a bit more of security of supply. However, the vanilla, what we pick up from the market is really a cost saving and a carbon saving drive that comes from the private sector. Now, if you're on, for instance, an Eskom Megaflex tariff, it's quite difficult to compete economically with very small scale projects. So we're excited about the energy intensive user group, mining per se, large industrials, what their needs could be and how it could be filled with renewable energy. First port of call may be companies looking at self-generation with solar facilities, and the regulations do now allow for that, and everybody is studying that as far as we're aware. But then there's the augmentation with wind, maybe for the evening period, and or storage. Now, storage may not be there yet in terms of its economic viability, but it will be there soon. And as soon as you have that complete package, you really have flexibility to choose which energy you want to use as a user, which gives you the optimal saving in terms of costs, but very importantly also in terms of carbon. So it's really an exciting opportunity with the change in regulations for companies to now actively participate and look at possible solutions that I've mentioned, combinations of solutions. And for the whole country then, if a large number of companies, and especially these large users, actively participate and have either do their own or purchase from an IPP or whatever commercial model suits them. But if there's more and more private renewable energy being produced and procured, it also releases the grid, it releases Eskom with their current supply issues, and it's all really beneficial to the country. Last comment maybe is also on the just energy transition. You know, acutely aware of the environmental pressures, but at the same time also the social responsibility we have in the country to not just stop everything and charge to a new solution, but to really do it in a phased approach, a well thought through approach that suits the country and that still has the communities where we operate, the people, our employees in mind, to actually reskill people, to give them the opportunity to participate in the in a newer space. The renewable energy space is maybe not that new in the world, but it's a new drive for South Africa, exciting drive that will kick off. But people need time to actually transition the skills and to get really going in the renewable energy. And things like the REIPPP program and the bid windows that are continuously implemented, that provides the basis for the manufacturing industry in South Africa to also establish itself and to continue and thrive. And that will also suit what I mentioned about the private sector being involved and getting the supply going with local procurement. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Dani. Let me turn to Ms. Lucy Chege from the DBSA, just for her views on the various financing options or financing structures available, particularly to the embedded generation sector. I think the utility scale sector, which is operating pursuant to the procurement programs, fairly well understood, but the embedded generation market is still developing. So your thoughts on financing for those projects?
All right. Thank you very much, Sasha, and good morning, Honorable Deputy Minister and fellow panelists, and thank you to the DTIC and the DMRE for providing us this opportunity to make these remarks. So Sasha, I think just on your point, we've seen a lot of activity within the embedded generation space. As you say, the REIPPP program and REIPPP, those are well known and have developed bankable frameworks which financiers are comfortable with. So given the opening up of the space, as has been discussed, we've seen a lot of projects coming to us looking for funding. And indeed, they're developing quite nicely. And this is an area which is exciting. We think that there's a lot of scope. What we have done as a DBSA, we have entered into an agreement with the global, the Green Climate Facility, the Global Climate Facility, that's a GCF. And what we have there, we have 100 million that has been invested by the DBSA, and another 100 million that's in US dollars by the GCF. And the intention of this funding is really to support these projects, which and to make them more bankable, because there could be some hesitation. We understand that as a financier. And so we are looking to credit support those projects. And so we think it's a very exciting space. We're seeing a lot of opportunities. We're seeing a lot of people coming forward with proposals. It's mainly targeted towards onshore wind and PV. So those are the two that we're looking at. So that 200 million is available, and we're looking at the projects as they keep coming to us. So it's a space that is growing. It's a space that's very exciting, and we're looking to see more. And a lot of private companies are really looking to explore this space. So I can leave those comments at that, and if there are any follow-ups, you can then let me know.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Perhaps I can go back to Bernard. You mentioned that in addition to the requirement to put megawatts onto the grid, there's also local content localization requirements. And it's quite fairly easier to deal with that in a utility scale procurement process, because those requirements are then made part of the rules of participating in that program. So how do you see those requirements being carried through to embedded generation projects?
Thank you, Sasha. This is the area that we are busy engaging with the DTIC now. They have come up with some ideas, which I think would have been great for DTIC to share with the market. But I'm sure there will be announcements being made on how they can manage that space. But from our side, if I can maybe zone in on that, we will continue to pursue that space. And I think with the current volatility in the international market, I think this provides an opportunity for local manufacturers to also now jump in and take advantage of this space. So I think with the amount of energy that we require, I mean, South Africa is energy hungry at the moment. I do believe that market forces are at the point that we should see more investment in this manufacturing space, not necessarily through regulations, but I understand there's some work being done within DTIC as well. which may also impact in what happens in the embedded generation space.
Sasha, if you would allow me to just add to your question, our experience from private sector customers in their allocation of their own tender processes for power, that the ESG, environmental, social, and governance issue are hugely important for those companies. So in their selection of providers for power, that they look very strongly at the aspects around empowerment of companies, the aspects around the impact on local communities where they operate, whether it's mines or breweries, or in our case, where we supplied Amazon, those are hugely important considerations. So without regulations, companies are very focused on their ESG commitments and are including that in their private sector procurement. We as a company committed absolutely, we're going to take 40%, close to 40% of our shares of our company. And that has to go to more than just empowerment of one or two people. It has to go to youth in South Africa, to women, and to many others, which technology and this industry, both on the utility side, the program Bernard runs, or for that matter on the private sector side, really allows others to be empowered. And we fully committed in actually implementing that restructuring. And if South African companies don't invest in that, then we're missing an opportunity, not just as South Africa, but I would suggest in the broader continent. The one point I'd like to make is for local manufacturing, it's usually important that we focus on where do we have a competitive advantage. And Deputy Minister raised something very interesting. I think it's important that we localize as much as we can and should, but we should really drive our young people and our skills to the economy beyond 2030. And the Deputy Minister spoke about green hydrogen and the developments around there. And as a country, we must take those competitive advantages. And one of them is an abundance of sun, an abundance of wind, an abundance of land, a large grid that we do have, and a large energy system, as well as this abundance of platinum and an abundance of young people. And we need to bring that together in delivering some of our energy solutions. Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. Lucy, just a quick question to you while we're on this topic of localization. Is it a requirement of lenders that, in addition to the bankability of the project and general project finance principles, that there's a localization requirement in order to qualify for funding?
Thank you, Sasha. So in the renewable programs, the ones that Bernard spoke about, the REIPPP programs, yes, it is a requirement. So we also make sure that we follow what the rules are. And because we understand the importance of making sure that there's that localization element, it is a requirement, and that has to be met. Similarly, as we're working through the embedded generation, we are seeing how we can discuss with the private sector how to ensure that there are those elements incorporated, so that it's not just about the money, but it's also about the socioeconomic aspects, ensuring that there's empowerment in the company, ensuring there's localization, ensuring there's development, and making sure as well from an environmental perspective, everything is above board. So those aspects are key, and it is a requirement. So you have to make sure that those are catered for. And in the funding, we looked at that quite critically as well.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. Danny, perhaps I can go to you. We've spoken quite a lot about the opportunity that's available. Have you got any views on whether there are any risks or barriers?
Yeah, Sasha, there's a number of risks in the renewable energy play, especially when it's private to private, of course, that needs to be taken into account. One thing, for instance, is the life of a project. For instance, if you sell to a mining company, the question is not only the ability of that company to honor the PPA in terms of their own balance sheet and strength, but it's also about the future. And what Lucy has mentioned about how banks view it in terms of the fundability. if a mine has a physical life, a resource life of say 40 years, of course that's advantageous, but the commodity cycle is going up and down, as we're all very aware, and the economic life of a mine may be much, much shorter. Hence, a project and a PPA term and a tenor that a bank or a funder would give you tends to be shorter. And where the REIPPP program is very structured, it's a brilliant program, but it's very known, it's well known, and it's within its boundaries. That's tremendously helpful. In private to private, every solution is a bespoke solution that needs to be fully understood in terms of the opportunity and the risk. So that's just one. It's the funding risk and the life of the off-taker. Other risks, of course, is your ability as the producer to actually supply. If you have, and again, I get to economies of scale and smaller users, because we wouldn't only like to help large companies achieve their goals. We also would like to assist all companies in South Africa and smaller companies. So we need to be really innovative to actually get to economies of scale, number one, but also to get to large players, EPC contractors, for instance, to actually be willing to be involved in smaller projects that may not be their first priority, if I can call it that. And there, a portfolio approach is very helpful if one could achieve a number of companies that you want to assist with projects, and then also have the EPCs involved over that same portfolio and other players. I'm just picking EPCs as an example at this stage. So that is another risk, is the size, but then the ability, the opportunities then to actually have it mitigated by a portfolio approach. And then the last big one maybe to mention, and Bernard has spoken about it, is the grid. Of course, the grid, and especially if there's wheeling involved, there's wheeling charges that are, amongst others, one of the elements of the wheeling charge is where the generator is located and where the off-taker is located, and the current state of the grid, whether it adds to the grid stability or it doesn't. And that changes over time. As new bid windows in REIPPP get allocated, the grid changes. So there's a bit of uncertainty about how that would affect the wheeling, not only the wheeling, the cost of wheeling, but also the ability to wheel and the contracting of wheeling. So that's wheeling, but more importantly, also, even if it's not wheeling, if it's a direct supply to a customer, changes in the grid and accessibility of the grid and the ability to actually connect to the grid for maybe in future wheeling of excess or utilizing storage, changes is a risky business. So we try to really keep it simple, focus on the low-hanging fruit first, where things are a bit more stable, a bit more understood, and have that as your basis for a project, and then immediately start looking at how can it be augmented with maybe somewhat riskier or somewhat more unknown elements to it, but things that we believe in future will actually be beneficial to the customer.
Yes, thanks very much, Dani. Turning back to Mr. Gwede, just on the registration that we spoke about that will be coming out in the next few weeks, hopefully. Perhaps could you just give us an indication of what will the requirements for registration be with regards to project readiness? How far must your project be before you can apply to register a project? So for example, if you're applying for a generation license, you would need to have a fully permitted project, have a signed PPA. Is it a similar requirement for registration, or can it be done at a little bit of an earlier stage?
Thanks, Sasha, for your question. I think, as has been happening with the embedded generators less than 1 megawatt, there is no, what you're saying is that the practice in terms of what needs to be done is well established, and there is no intention to actually make it a bit more onerous. Clearly, though, is that it may have been easy, I think, for developers of projects of less than 1 megawatt to actually get authorization by the grid operators or the grid owners, because at least in terms of 1 megawatt, the impact on the grid would have been minimal. However, when we're talking about the large production, potentially that might be produced somewhere else and actually wheeled to a different location of the order of the 100 megawatts, then clearly that the grid owners would actually have a bit more to say about that in terms of their ability to actually handle that, especially the intimacy of the production, depending on the type of energy facility that is being used to actually produce energy. So when it comes to NERSA, there are no further changes to what is already known, which is the market, what the market, basically in terms of what the market already understands. And that will be clarified when the registration procedures are published. However, of course, I think the challenge is going to be about the ability of the grid owners to then agree and sign up agreements with the producers, both in terms of willing and also just in terms of their ability to actually deal with this new power that might be coming on stream. So the bottleneck, we'd like to believe, is not going to be. In fact, what we've done is committed, as you will see when these are published, we've committed to actually effecting the decision from reduced it from 60 days, which is what it used to be, to 45 days. So we've actually, by tightening and changing a little bit of the delegation matrices, we've managed to actually drop the number of days that it would take to actually to approve a project. But clearly, we are right at the tail end. By the time the project comes to us, the assumption is that it's got all of the other dots and T's that have been crossed. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mr. Gwede. Brian, I asked Adani from a private sector perspective, what were some of the risks and barriers to participating in embedded generation projects? And perhaps I can get your views as well.
Thank you, Sasha. I mean, from our experience and our company quite early on invested into a platform that has been quite active in this market. We're now the largest shareholder, and in the solar group, and the solar group has been able to build a portfolio of projects. About 30 megawatts a year gets rolled out, and is now scaling up, and that portfolio does everything from the EPC work to the asset management work, and so the full value chain participation. So our task now is how do we scale that up? And that certainly, you know, as you go from 1 megawatt to 100, so you need to make sure you scale properly. And we have seen, firstly, as I've said, we recently got awarded significant megawatts from mining companies, so we're busy rolling that up. And we're now talking to financiers and particularly to large South African construction companies. As Dani said, how do you get them involved in this full value chain? Now, because we've got a portfolio, we can now successfully scale up. And again, we've had great support from all the large South African construction companies, and those discussions are starting. On the financing side, as of this week, we have had large commercial banks saying to us, we're prepared to do private sector tenors on senior debt more than 18 years. Now, fundamental change, big change, and that gives, again, a signal that the commercial banks in South Africa are very supportive, understands this market a lot better, given that you've done 1 megawatts, we've done the first wheeling in the country for Amazon. We're now moving to, you know, our projects with the likes of Sasha. We're now increasing to 300 megawatts of projects. And that gives confidence for the financing industry to be, and I'm sure Lucy on her side will even beat that from a tenor perspective. Now, we don't think through our financing on PPA terms. You know, the sun doesn't move really, and the wind doesn't really move that much. Once you have the grid connection, it also doesn't move, and there's significant value in that. And we think beyond that PPA terms. And the question is, and the great opportunity about this 100 megawatts in South Africa at this point in time, and I would suggest over the next 10 years, is the fact that South African mining companies has mostly got the best grid connections. And the grid would also push the country to invest in provinces in the country that previously has been left out of this program. And even in Bernard's Round 5 program, we now see ourselves moving into parts of the country that previously we haven't. KwaZulu-Natal, Free State, the Eastern Cape. And so that's hugely important to make sure this development is spread throughout the country. And so the private sector market allows you to also do that. So yes, there are risks, but it's very important that you do build a very solid platform to be able to then mitigate this. But we've seen great support from South African lenders, both the DFIs, the commercial banks, as well as I now say, some large South African construction companies approaching us to participate in that market.
Thank you, Brian. Bernard, given the various historical rounds that we've had, have there been any lessons learned in the rounds and any efficiencies that will be carried through into the next rounds going forward?
Thank you, Sasha. Yes, there has been quite a number of lessons. I think even starting with the ED space, you have noticed that with bid window 5, we've actually increased quite a lot on the targets and the thresholds. Even with the fact that we did not get the exemption from REIPPP to create a competitive scorecard, we still managed to achieve more or less the same commitments that we had in the previous rounds. So we have learned quite a lot from the previous rounds, and we are implementing these changes in the new rounds. And obviously, now with the grid, where the grid is going, as Brian mentioned, the high yield areas are saturated, and we don't expect those to be solved tomorrow. So which means we have to look at how do we channel investment to those areas? How do we work together with ESCOM in their just energy transition to make sure that we start tapping into other provinces? Yes, it will come at a premium, but we need energy like yesterday. And then other areas, we're also looking at the current reform. We believe that sooner or later there will be a market in the country. So the program cannot ignore the fact that the space is changing. So we're also looking at how do we manage the transition? How do we make sure that the programs that we sign going forward are able to evolve into the new market structures? So those are some of the lessons that we have learned. But on the granular level, there's quite a lot in the drafting space, especially around the ED. We're bringing in more youth, as Brian mentioned, and women empowerment in the scorecard now as one of the mandatory requirements. And yeah, we'll continue to learn and evolve the program. But I think the key issue is around the market evolution. That cannot be ignored. The embedded generation space, the private PPA space that's happening, we need to take that into account. And lastly, the government guarantees that's been provided over the years. We are now busy doing a study to see whether we still need the guarantee for this utility scale program, and also not to forget the size as well. With the 100 megawatts now being a threshold for embedded generation, or rather the limit for embedded generation, we're also asking ourselves, should the program, PV is currently limited at 75 megawatts. Is that still relevant given the lifting of the embedded generation limits? Similarly, wind, it's at 140 megawatts. And we have seen that there are cases where instead of, 280 megawatts PV farm, same land, what the developers do, they just cut into half and bid as 2 different projects. Maybe there's a need to look at, lifting those limits as well. So there's quite a number of areas where we're busy looking at how do we evolve the program. But maybe before I conclude on this one, Mr. Gwede spoke about grid stability. That is the one big issue that we should not forget in South Africa. We are an island electrically, and therefore we cannot ignore the fact that these renewables are intermittent in nature, and when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining, there has to be other resources to carry us along. Battery storage, I think I think it's Danny who mentioned that it's still in the development space, but we have seen from the risk mitigation that we are almost there. It's competitive. It's getting to a point where perhaps at large scale, that's something that we consider as well. But between now and then, we need to think hard about how do we manage the grid. So you will see in bid window 6, one of the requirements from Eskom is that these projects must provide ancillary services, meaning be able to ramp up and down in response to changes in demand. So yeah, there's quite a number of areas where we are looking at improving the program going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we're almost coming to the end of the session. So I'd just like to ask, before I ask each of the panelists just to give us any closing remarks they may have, just a general question to Mr. Gwede on, is there any other updates to the regulatory environment? We've only really spoken to you about the 100 megawatt registration process. Any other envisaged amendments to, for example, the Electricity Regulation Act or anything else of interest to note?
Thanks, Sasha. Actually, I'm glad you did finally ask me that question, because they are. And clearly, the changes are coming on two fronts. There would be policy and legislative changes, which are clearly fall squarely in the domain of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, and to which, yes, ENSA needs to contribute. So we are preparing our own input in that regard. And it would be useful to actually get the MRE's input into this. We all know that there is a potential amendment to the ERA, the Electricity Regulation Act, that's in the pipeline, and associated changes to the electricity pricing policy. So, but the question is always to say, does NERSA lead that discussion, participate in that discussion in parallel, or does it just follow in that discussion? I guess we actually play all three roles in that particular case. But clearly, the changes which has been brought about by the increased threshold for 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts, especially with the requisite changes to or request for explicit and clear willing charges, number one. Number two, for developers to be able to sell to one or more customers. That on its own has brought about a need for a change. And clearly, as you'd be aware, there is, yes, the restructuring that at the moment is driven largely by the shareholder department, the Department of Public Enterprises. However, the actual restructuring of the industry, as Bernard has been, which Bernard has been alluding to, that clearly we are, the market is evolving, and we are looking to actually have a market structure in a distant future. So as NERSA, we need to prepare our regulatory framework, pricing framework, to be able to respond to that. But clearly, the biggest issue again, which is what Bernard has also been alluding to, the issue that South Africa is electrically an island, is that when projects are designed and the large investment in the project is largely, for instance, solar, which, as you know, has got a start and the end, a start time and an end time, but the demand perhaps continues beyond that, is that there clearly needs to be a system of pricing that is responsive, that can support that framework. For instance, in other markets, you have a balancing tariff. Clearly, we need to actually, as NERSA, be preparing for that. And also, you mentioned the issue of provision of ancillary services. Clearly, those need to be well understood and correctly priced. So on the side of NERSA, other than the policy changes that NERSA can comment to and actually respond to, on the side of NERSA, NERSA is clearly looking to actually change its pricing to be able to respond to the changes that are happening in industry. I hope that clarifies it, Sasha. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. It does. And looking forward to seeing these updates in due course, especially to the pricing policies and the amendments to the ERA, which is the Electricity Regulation Act. We've got 3 minutes left. Let me just quickly run through each of the panelists just to see if there's any closing remarks. I'll start off with the private sector. Donnie, any closing remarks?
Just very briefly, again, it's a very exciting opportunity, and Brian and Lucy, I think both have alluded to it, that the regulations that comes from REIPPP program, or the requirements from REIPPP program, there aren't those requirements in the private sector, private to private players. However, the private sector must be commended with people actively implementing, all the empowerment, all the localization, everything that's been done. It's really, really top priority for the companies in South Africa, the potential customers we've spoken to. So even though there's not a specific requirement, the companies are really coming to the party and doing their best for South Africa. And I believe this Schedule 2 and the further amendments that will help private sector to play in the electricity space is really a great thing for the country. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Donnie. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Sasha. I just want to build on what our colleagues from the SIR and IPP office said. South Africa is an island, a peninsula. Unlike other countries around the world that are fully integrated, we're not. And so as we move forward, renewables will play a significantly increasingly important role. But we can't just rely on renewables. South Africa's got one of the largest electricity energy systems in the world, a grid that is as big as Western Europe. And we need all of these technologies to be able to meet our climate commitments, be able to drive this transition. But renewables on its own will not be able to answer that. We are invested through the Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund with the likes of Bill Gates on new technologies that allows us to then accelerate the breakthrough of storage, long-term duration storage solutions, the hydrogen issues, even in the case of clean fuels for aviation and many other. And so that investment in technology and the country continuing to focus again on its future would be very important, because what we currently have alone will not be able to meet our energy needs going forward. And we would need to build on new technologies to accelerate that and keep that what we currently have in good shape and working. And that's going to be very important for us. But, an exciting place to be, not only in South Africa, but in the rest of the continent. And we as a company will remain committed to this transition. Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you, Brian. Lucy, any closing remarks?
Thank you, Sasha. So I just want to echo what the two panelists have said. It's an exciting place to be. From a financing point of view, we've seen the REIPPP program develop now. It's a very mature program and bankability is well understood. And what has happened with that is that essentially the investors and financiers are taking those lessons into the embedded generation, as you've heard from both Brian and Danny, that indeed the parties are working together to see how we can make this bankable, what would traditionally not have been bankable in terms of tenor. As you can hear, now it is becoming bankable. And so it's exciting to see all those developments and the involvement of that market. There is significant interest both locally, and we've also seen a lot of international investors contacting us to see how we can work together on these. So it's an exciting place, I think, with all these programs, the ones Bernard mentioned, the embedded generation. And together, I think the partnerships that we can build with other parties will then help us to continue to grow this and to evolve the market. It's evolving very well. And from a financing point of view, I think the risks are being well taken care of, and there's a good understanding about them. So that will just be my closing remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And Sasha, let me hand it over to you for any closing remarks.
Thanks, Sasha. Just one. I mean, for me, I think we'd like to request that the private sector, as it considers all of these investments, especially in this clean energy, which is great, that to consider also investing in supportive ancillary services, including storage. Because the challenge is that, as Brian has clearly indicated, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for South Africa to just invest in one form of energy, which when the sun sets, then that's it, we don't have energy, because that's not how our economy functions. So we need to be able to ensure the effective management of the grid, that we actually have a balanced investment. So yes, we do understand that private developers will probably have their focal areas, but we really request and implore that the private sector also looks at other investments that will balance the grid. NERSA will support in terms of licensing and registration, but I think all as a team, we need to put our hands together to actually make sure that we deliver good quality stability of the grid and pricing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And finally, Bernard, any closing remarks before we close the panel discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. Look, from my side is just to reiterate that, the next 10 years, the stage is set. We know we need at least 20 gigawatt, and that's before the current performance that we're seeing in Eskom, which means we need a lot more than 20 gigawatts of renewables. The question really for all of us, and I think for investors as well, how can we maximize the benefits for the country and across the value chain? Being a developer is one space, but there are a lot of opportunities that this 20 gigawatt can bring to the country. And that's what we need to do. And to working together, all the players sitting here and everybody else, to make sure that we bring that manufacturing back into the country, like we had in the last 5 years before the program stalled. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you once again to the Honourable Deputy Minister. Thank you very much to the panels. I think this was a very interesting and informative discussion. We heard about the pipeline for the next 10 years, both from a utility scale and an embedded generation. We also heard a little bit about the upcoming amendments to the restructuring of the electricity supply industry and the creation of a market, which will be very exciting. So thanks everyone for a very informative discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha.